has been broadcasted. We also see that there's an attempt to reclaim a narrative that has been lost by the Israeli government because of their brutal actions in breach of all the norms and laws of concern to the international community. I raise this because this kind of impunity is at the heart of why the Hague Group was formed. All of us, we must all maintain the space to call out the atrocious and unlawful actions of the attackers in Sydney and the actions of the Israeli state that continues its genocidal actions in Palestine and its unlawful armed attacks in Syria and Lebanon. The Hague Group was established a year ago to protest against Israeli impunity in particular. Not only Israeli impunity, but in particular Israeli impunity. We also sought through the machinations rather of, Guillaume and I have a verb for when something special is done, we call it vashaing. Because there's a strategic intent and work that was done to establish the Hague Group. And it was established to protest against, as I said, Israeli impunity, but also in partnership with other states and civil society to lay the basis for an approach to international law and justice that holds all those who breach international norms and laws equally accountable. This in the context of a skewed application of international law with the powerful, and particularly Israel through systemic impunity, has enjoyed exceptionalism from accountability to international law. What we said then is that the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza was and remains one of the most notable breaches of international law in recent times. Hence, I think, as Varsha has pointed out, the specific focus last January on what happened in Gaza. We stated then, and we state again, that we need to hold all actors, whether state or non-state, accountable for similar breaches wherever they occur, including in Sudan, the DRC, and Ukraine, amongst others. This was the essence of the declaration we agreed to in our inaugural meeting in January 2024. We're not going to go through the declaration again, but it underscored accountability from all of us. We lamented that despite the numerous breaches of international law, including the various ICJ rulings, including our own case, and some of the advisory opinions before and after, and reports by expert UN bodies, many countries, most notably those that were at some stage settler colonial regimes themselves, and have themselves committed some of the international crimes that Israel is committing today, including the crime of genocide, continue to support Israel's unlawful presence and actions in Palestine. In contrast to this, in January last year, developing countries gathered to agree on a program of action to defend the institutions of global governance, including the International Criminal Court, which at that stage already we saw the sanctions being threatened by the US. And that was under a Biden administration. And we can see that now under the Trump administration, those sanctions and actions have been put into place. At that stage, we verbally protested against it, but I think more work needs to be done to deal with the sanctions and attacks on the courts by the most powerful. And it's not just the US. I think we can see some of the other most powerful players also attacking the integrity of the ICC. We also need to defend the ICJ, and the ICJ is different from the ICC. The ICC is a statute, a treaty-based instrument that through negotiations countries can ratify and opt out of, which we think they should not. The ICJ was founded through the UN Charter, and all members of the UN are bound by the ICJ. And we see now, because of the actions of an international law subaltern like ourselves, to take the most powerful to that apex court, that there are now attacks on the ICJ as well. The Hague Group also seeks to protect the ICJ from these kinds of attacks. And I must emphasize, it is the international law subalterns, that is, people and countries that many in the West believe were the only subjects of international law, that is now at the forefront of building an international legal order that is just and fair. And I think that is the novelness of the Hague Group. The UN is established to do that. There's many other fora in the UN that deals with development and human rights, but not a single grouping such as this that seeks to hold all of us accountable for what is just and fair. We were and remain convinced that enabling Israeli impunity undermines the integrity of the international law system and its courts, but importantly, it harms the capacity of these institutions to end impunity. We stated then, and we repeat, we should not be complicit in Israel's endeavors to irreparably harm the institutions that were established to hold all of us accountable, and all of us accountable for the goals of a more peaceful and just world. I want to conclude by just re-emphasizing it's supposed to hold all of us accountable, but South Africa will continue to act within the institutions of global governance to protect, in particular, the rights of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. The rights of Palestinians which are egregiously being breached and taken away by Israel, which has enjoyed institutional impunity for 7 decades. The Hague Group is one of those markers that has been laid down that says we will stop impunity now, and we hope other states join us. Fasha, I'll end there.
Thank you, Zain. I'd like to now invite Yara Hawari to the lectern, please.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here today with all of you to mark nearly 1 year of the Hague Group. And I think it's not a coincidence that this particular formation has been led by states from the global south, all of whom have had very intimate and direct experiences of colonialism and colonial domination. Now, the Hague Group emerged in a world where the impunity that is afforded to the Israeli regime knows no bounds. And before I talk further about the Hague Group, I want to talk a little bit about that world. Throughout the genocide in Gaza and throughout the Israeli regime's existence of nearly 8 decades, it has continued to enjoy Western diplomatic, financial, and military cover. No matter what it does, no matter how many red lines it crosses, no matter how many Palestinians it slaughters. And I think it's been quite shocking for many of us. The question of how could this happen has frequently been voiced. And it's a question that I've asked myself over and over. And I think it's a completely human question. But it's also one that has a very rational answer. A context of entwined forces of imperial interests, white supremacy, and settler colonialism are the conditions that have long provided the Israeli regime with sweeping impunity. Indeed, understanding the Israeli regime as both a product of Western imperialism and as a quasi-US outpost in the Middle East is crucial. This mutually dependent relationship is in many ways existential. Israel's survival as a settler colonial and apartheid state hinges on US material and diplomatic backing. Without it, Israel would face profound challenges to its continuity. And likewise, Israel's role is pivotal to American interests in the region. This context underscores that what is happening in Gaza and Palestine today is not an aberration, but a continuation of a settler colonial project that began over a century ago. What is unfolding in Palestine is not an isolated event, but part of a broader global history of violent, dispossessive tactics aimed at eliminating indigenous peoples and solidifying settler colonial control over land. And it would be amiss for me to not take a moment to describe the damage that has been wrought by the genocide in Gaza, which is monumental and ongoing. Gaza has endured 2 years of constant bombardment, estimated to equal roughly 6 times the explosive force of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, concentrated on an area less than half the size of Hiroshima. The official number of Palestinians killed by the Israeli regime is 69,000, and a further 10,000 to 14,000 bodies have yet to be recovered from the rubble. Yet a more accurate number of those killed in the genocide will be much higher. An article that you may have all seen in the Lancet Medical Journal explains that in typical conflicts, a conservative estimate of 4 indirect deaths per 1 direct death is usual. This means that the actual death toll in Gaza could be well over 300,000. Beyond the staggering loss of life, the physical and social fabric of Gaza has been shattered, and the Strip's essential infrastructure, water, electricity, sanitation, has been systematically dismantled. Gaza's health system has been utterly decimated. Every hospital has been bombed. Hundreds of medical workers have been killed or abducted, and life-saving aid continues to be blocked. It is precisely this decades-old impunity that made all of this, the genocide, not just foreseeable, but inevitable. The absence of consequential international action to hold Israel accountable for its violations, compounded by the unwavering support from powerful global actors, has facilitated an environment in which such atrocities can occur without significant consequence. The latest iteration of this came on November 17th of this year when the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2803, after what we know was a lot of political coercion. The resolution endorsed Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza. It effectively gives the green light for an additional layer of colonial control, and it negates Palestinians' right to self-govern and self-determination. And this resolution, it goes without saying, made no mention of genocide, let alone any kind of accountability mechanisms for war crimes. Quite simply, it's a reward for the co-perpetrators of genocide. And the cherry on the cake, I think, for Palestinians was that the Palestinian Authority signed off on this. All of this makes it explicitly clear the ceasefire is not a ceasefire at all. This is a new phase of the genocide, an arrangement that allows for the Israeli regime to pivot amidst its dwindling military capabilities. And calling this arrangement a ceasefire allows third states to claim progress when the core reality of Palestinians on the ground remains unchanged. In a recent op-ed for The Guardian, Nasreen Malik called this a reduced fire, and indeed hundreds of Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the ceasefire. The reality is that this is a diplomatic sham. It's a cover for continuing extermination, displacement, and the erasure of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And Resolution 2803 also demonstrates that this is a global genocide. And by that, I mean that the level of complicity is huge, intimate, and widespread. And because it is so global, Palestine cannot be understood on its own, isolated from global dynamics. Palestine exists in a deeply unjust, violent, and still colonial world. And it is this global reality that allows the machinery of genocide in Palestine to continue unabated. Today, we are witnessing the legitimization of apartheid and colonization at the highest levels of our international legal order. Rather than ensuring that the rulings of the ICC and the ICJ about Israeli violations of the Genocide Convention are pursued, instead, we are seeing measures being put in place to reinforce Israeli domination with foreign forces, as we saw with the resolution. International law and systems of global governance have long been accused of being vehicles for Western hegemony. The genocide in Gaza, for many of us, has clarified the degree of co-option. And it's also shown how international multilateral institutions remain actively complicit in supremacist structures. The genocide has also shown us how mass slaughter can be automated and AI generated. And this is a development that is not only worrying for Palestinians, but also for others around the world. President Gustavo Petro of Colombia, one of the chairs of the Hague Group, explained that what we see in Gaza is a rehearsal for the rest of the world. And he's right. What we're seeing in the Caribbean at the moment is incredibly ominous, and what we're seeing happening in Sudan, all of these violent structures are connected and reinforce one another. But so are the struggles against them. Writing on the Egyptian revolution, writer and former political prisoner Ala Abdel Fattah wrote, "The day Cairo was liberated, we thought that Jerusalem was near, and so we sped towards Gaza. The road to Jerusalem looked like it ran through Cairo, but what is certain that it must pass through Gaza. And what has been more clear in the last few years is that the Palestinian liberation struggle is not just about Palestine. It's a symbol for struggle for freedom everywhere. And these struggles are being fought on multiple fronts and levels. And this brings me back to the Hague Group. The Hague Group charts an alternative path for states to follow, one that challenges US hegemony and geopolitical hierarchy, one that insists even when international bodies fail to uphold international law, states are not absolved from their obligations. And this is important because it's an exercise in the possible. It's an exercise in non-submission, and it's an exercise in the subversive. And so in many ways, it is a breakthrough, even if it is a small one. And I'm not naive, and I know that many of you here are also not naive. We know that there is often a difference between what states say and what they do. But we also know that decisions like joining the Hague Group can be reversed just as quickly as they're made, depending on election outcomes. But complacency is not an option. In his prison diaries, Antonio Gramsci wrote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And indeed, the liberal world order is crumbling away, and in its place, the monsters of militarism, authoritarianism, and impunity are rising. Yet in this interregnum, this terrifying moment of transition and change, there are also opportunities. Opportunities like the Hague Group. Opportunities to carve out a new path and to reorganize with liberation for all of us as the horizon. Because Palestine will free us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. I'd like to now invite Saleh Ejazi.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. A great honor to be among you, among ex-foreign ministers, great leaders of the movement as well. Let me just do this, I'm a tall one. On the 3rd of October, a so-called ceasefire was announced. But as one colleague has put it, what was announced was that you seize, I fire. Israel's genocide in Gaza continues. As we speak, bombing continues. Men, women, children are dying because of this bombing, are dying because of disease, because of the cold, because of the lack of food, because Israel continues to deny humanitarian aid in. Tents are being swept away by the rain because it's the winter season now in Palestine. Homes and the rubble of homes is being collapsed on the heads of people. Elsewhere in colonized Palestine, apartheid Israel continues to kill, to displace, to ethnically cleanse. In the Naqab, in the south, in the desert, as we speak, entire communities are being forcibly displaced out of their homes. And as we speak right now, in the occupied West Bank, in Tul Karim, in the refugee camp of Tul Karim, there are 25 homes being demolished in an attack against these refugee camps, against the refugees and their rights to return. In Jerusalem, settlers on daily basis continue to entrench and expand their reach within Al-Aqsa compound. Thousands continue to languish in Israeli prisons, in what the UN describes torture and a state policy of torture. Really, nothing has changed since the 3rd of October. But let me tell you what may and we should not allow to change. On the eve of the 3rd of October, Netanyahu stood up to speak to his people and said that we're facing unprecedented isolation and that we should become super Sparta, that we should rely on ourselves. And this is because indeed Israel was facing an unprecedented isolation thanks to people power and the mobilization of people like you and all around the world. Israel was being kicked out of the academia, of cultural spaces, of sports. Even companies that are complicit in Israel's crimes were losing businesses, including in places where there is repression and very little spaces for civil society and movement, like in the Arab Gulf. Take, for example, the supermarket of Carrefour, the French company that was shut down in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Oman. But not only. For the first time in many decades, over now reaching 80 years of Israel's settler colonial regime of apartheid and genocide, that we're beginning to see states take action. Again, thanks to people power and mobilization and the establishment of the Hague Group in January, and then states coming together in the Bogota Declaration, we began to see, or a signal of a turning point. The Hague Group showed that the Global South can still speak and act in the soul and in the spirit of the Bandung Conference, in the Bandung movement. It can stand up to uphold international law. It can stand up to uphold the multilateral system. And following this brave and pioneering action by global state countries, South Africa, Bolivia, Colombia, Namibia, European states began to follow. Slovenia announced that it will impose a military embargo on Israel along with other measures. Belgium said that it will take 12 measures against Israel. Spain has actually legislated a military embargo with shortcomings, but it was unprecedented that we have now a European country, a major European power, actually take action. That was the eve of the 3rd of October. So let us be clear. The Trump plan, which is an American-Israeli genocidal colonial plan, came to save Israel from this isolation. It came to allow Israel to finish the job. And it came to bring a new colonial rule over Palestinians. Yes, starting in Gaza, but nothing can stop it from expanding and going elsewhere. And I think most dangerously, it also came to bring in Arab and Global South states to be part of this now, including Muslim-majority countries. And as Yara was saying, the consequences of this will be devastating, not only to us Palestinians, who are really under an existential threat, but also all around the world. Because if this succeeds in Gaza, there's nothing that is going to stop it to succeed elsewhere. In Sudan, in Somalia, in Yemen, in Congo, and so on. And we're already seeing this happen. You know, what Yara was saying about Gustavo Petro, President Gustavo Petro was saying that Gaza is a rehearsal for the rest of us here around the world. Indeed, the bombing of these fishing boats off the coast of Venezuela, without any question, the killing of people, without any question, without let alone accountability and justice, is exactly how, you know, I kill because I have the might makes right paradigm can be imposed elsewhere. I can kill without any question, let alone justice and accountability. So what we need now is a response from us, the global majority. We've been expressing our views. We've been expressing in action, in mobilization, in BDS, and so on. And what we need is this global response to also support the Hague Group. So when we cannot stop India or the US from continuing to send explosives and weapons to Israel, we can block the route. And this is in the commitments of the Hague Group, not to allow the territorial waters and the ports of the states to be used to transport weapons and dual use, including energy, to Israel. So let us continue to mobilize and block the path, block the waterways. Let us block the Cape of Good Hope. Let us block the Mediterranean, and let us block the Strait of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia. When states continue to have relations, even establish new relations, like the Zambia, for example, with Israel, let us make our cities, our villages, and our towns free of apartheid. not to have any direct or indirect link with settler colonial apartheid Israel that continues to carry out genocide. Let us cut these links of complicity in universities, in schools, at home, in the towns and the villages. When Trump and Netanyahu want to push this new paradigm on us, let us push back. We are the global majority. We've proved that we can make it happen. This is why they came up with this and went and got the legitimacy of the so-called legitimacy of the Security Council. We are the global majority and we can make this happen. Let us make 2026 the year of the Hague Group, where we see these commitments being put into action, where no weapons can reach Israel, no energy can reach Israel. There are no public contracts that are given to Israeli companies or companies that are complicit in Israeli crimes, and where Israeli war criminals, those on top and those who are implementing the orders of those on top, face accountability and justice. The Hague Group is the most strategic group that we have at this moment. And it is only with the support of people power and the mobilization that we can see the commitments that were made in Bogota become a reality. Let's make 2026 the year where a comprehensive, targeted, lawful regime of sanctions is imposed on Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Saleh. I'd like to now invite Guillaume Long.
Such an honor to be on this stage with Farsha, Zain, Naledi, Yara, and Saleh, and such an honor and pleasure to be with you all today. People face their historic responsibility. And when we all met just under a year ago, this was the conclusion that we came to, that people in the streets of Europe and the United States and South Africa and many countries in the world, including the Global South, were facing the historic responsibility. But states were conspicuously absent. And it is this diagnosis that led us to say we need to do something. We need to go back to the spirit of Bandung. We need to go back to the spirit of what was then called Third Worldist collective action, now Global South collective action. We need to lead states to do something about this horrific genocide. And it's been a heavy lift. It's been very difficult. This is a difficult moment for collective action and collective action in the Global South. We've seen under the Trump administration particularly, but I would argue also under the Biden administration, countries being easily intimidated. The logic of transactionalism winning over the logic of collective action. The art of the deal, the bilateral deal. Some countries might diversify and speak to both sides, a little bit of China here and a little bit of US there, but real collective action together to stop divide and rule dynamics, to stop race to the bottom dynamics between peripheral neighbors, it's been really sorely lacking. And we see now, even in this new so-called multipolar era, a fragmentation of the world increasingly in spheres of influence that is not particularly reassuring. I mean, where I come from in Latin America, and we just saw this now with the national security strategy that's been published by the Trump administration. Okay, maybe a multipolar world, but if that means being the US's backyard, then that's not good enough. We need Global South collective action. We're seeing a reiteration in my region, for example, of the Monroe Doctrine, of, Saleh just said it, might makes right, of a new renewed militarization of the Caribbean, of threat of war. There's never been a US direct attack on the South American landmass. In fact, many covert actions, coups and conspiracies and all sorts of things. Of course, you know all about the coups. In fact, yesterday was a very sad day in a country you all know about, Chile, with the victory of a pro-Pinochet presidential candidate. That's how bad the situation is, actually. That's a good metaphor for how complicated the situation is in the global south right now. So, of course, we'd seen a lot of US coups and covert actions and so on and so forth, but we've never yet seen a attack, a military intervention, military invasion of the South American landmass. There have been many, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, attacks on the smaller countries of Central America and the Caribbean, but not on the larger states of South America, right? If you think about it, Venezuela has 28, 30 million inhabitants. The last time the US invaded and occupied a Latin American country was Panama with 2.5 million inhabitants, so less than 10 times less. So we hope that taboo of invading a South American states remains a taboo and dissuades the United States from acting. But the fact that we're even discussing it, the fact that there is that latent risk that you have the largest fleet ever summoned in the Caribbean with the largest aircraft carrier ever summoned in the Caribbean with 15,000 Marines on board ready to invade is just, I think, very symbolic of the incredible times in which we live in. And the fact that ultimately the global south, despite all the rhetoric and the celebration of global south solidarity, not so much. We're not really living through a Bandung 2.0. And this is the diagnosis that we all came to when the Hague Group was launched, that we needed to turn the page on this transactionalism, that we needed to stand together for the most important cause of our generation, Palestine. And we were lucky to count on the solidarity and goodwill and courage of South Africa, first and foremost. And I would say 3 champions to start off with: South Africa in the African continent, Malaysia in Asia, and Colombia in Latin America. And when we had 3, of course, each representing a different, well, this kind of tricontinental logic, right? One in each continent of the global south, then it was easier to get more. And eventually, as Varsha just explained, we got 8 countries to launch the Hague Group on the 31st of January of this year. 8 countries launching a group announcing 3 measures. And this is very important. I'll just spend 1 minute explaining this, but we did not want the Hague Group to be yet another talk shop, condemning and calling for and lamenting or repeating already agreed UN language. We wanted the Hague Group to act, and to act in compliance with international law. There is no shortage of legal clarity on the issue of Palestine, but there is a stark shortage of compliance with international obligations. And so this was what it was about. The 3 measures were essentially about accountability and serving arrest warrants. At a time, remember last year, when a number of countries were saying they wouldn't serve the arrest warrant because, so-called maybe presidential immunity, and yes for Putin, but not for Netanyahu, and all these kinds of contradictions that were actually emanating from key players and parties to the Rome Statute in the international system. So the first one, accountability. The second one, of course, no arms transfer, an arms embargo. And the third one, no harbor, no ports for genocide, for vessels carrying military equipment, fuel, dual-use items. Now, within a few months, these 8 countries convinced 31 countries to convene in Bogota. And there we were able to really consolidate the Hague Group and to make those 3 measures into 6 measures, much stronger, much stringent measures, following the same logic: arms embargo, no harbor for genocide, and also the issue of shipping and deflagging ships that would be carrying military equipment. Very important issue we also introduced on public investment, public contracting with corporations that are involved in the genocide. And finally, some measures on accountability. We included a very important measure on universal jurisdiction, so that the individuals, not just the senior leadership of Israel, but the soldiers, the individuals that have committed war crimes, could also be tried in the different courts of the different countries. And then a few months later, those 31 countries became 35 countries meeting in New York. Not all of these countries have joined the Hague Group, but it's important that they have been present and that we've been able to make them part of a broader conversation. We've mentioned Spain here, which is not a member of the Hague Group, but it's been going to all the meetings and it's been doing interesting things for sure, and pushing the European Union to do more things. Norway was present several occasions, not a member of the Hague Group, but part of that debate, and I think it's not a coincidence that Norway eventually announced that it was divesting parts of its sovereign wealth fund, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, from problematic companies. It's still not a done deal, but you know, we're part of that conversation. Of course, if you look at the historic United Nations General Assembly resolution endorsing the ICJ advisory opinion, we're talking of 124 states, and we're only getting 35 in the room. So those 124 states, well, you know, at least 90 of them are not in compliance with what they themselves voted for in the halls of United Nations, right? So we have a lot of work to do in 2026, a lot of work. And to repeat what Saleh just said, let 2026 be the year of the Hague Group, both for Palestine and Palestinians and their right to live in peace and with self-determination, but also for this new moment that Yara described as the interregnum, right? Where we, the people of the global south, want to be at the table when we discuss, debate the new world order that is to be created. It's rules of the game. I think it's very important because other institutions in the world are, again, conspicuously absent, and it's important for the Hague Group to be there. And we will continue in the struggle for a free Palestine and for the freedom of Palestine to in turn make us all free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guillaume. And now for our closing remarks of today's Meet the Hague Group in Cape Town, I'm honored and delighted to welcome Dr. Naledi Pandor.
I have to borrow my husband's glasses because I forgot mine, because everybody's making me rush all around the world and I'm really old. So it's something that people should stop doing. Well, you know, when I was a child, I was always the one who would tell on to my parents when my brothers and sisters did something wrong. And as an adult, I was really irritating to my colleagues at all the places I've worked at because I was always early for everything. So I'm going to be the party pooper as usual. I just want to latch on to all that has been said and say that I don't wish you to misconstrue what I'm going to say as meaning I do not welcome the formation of the Hague Group. I do. I really welcome it, and I hope that it would work hard to succeed in its mission. But what I thought I should talk about, based on my experience of the past few years, is what I see as the ideological challenge of international organizations today in the context of a declining political morality. I think the establishment of the Hague Group is a very positive development in the current toxic geopolitical environment. I always urge all activists, organizations, committed, right-thinking people that being cognizant of the environment in which you work is critical. Because if you are fully aware, you will not make assumptions that will cause your goal to fail. I was just at the airport arriving just now, and as usual, walking along, people are stopping me. What are you doing about Palestine? We haven't seen you on TV recently. What are you saying about Palestine? And I keep telling, I'm retired, I'm over 70. You know, but one gentleman was very clever. He stood in front of my trolley and made me stop and listen to him. And he said, you did a good job, you went to the ICJ, but the government isn't doing anything. What's happening? What are you saying now? So I tried to explain to him that actually going to the International Court of Justice was not Naledi Pandor's decision. It was the decision of the cabinet of the government of South Africa. And it's always important that we recall that. And then, you know, he went on how this matter of Palestine and the just cause of the Palestinian people is very important to the Muslim Ummah and is of great concern. And I said, it's a human rights issue. It should be of concern to all of us. Don't narrow it to a religious issue. It is a human rights question that all of us should be concerned about and involved in overcoming. So these are the incidents that I meet, and they're some of the responses of our communities that we've got to be able to develop responses to. I make this point particularly having met the gentleman at the airport, but also being involved in many other activities which raise issues such as these. In South Africa, the Muslim community has been absolutely sterling in highlighting the need for activism and being active in support of the just cause of the people of Palestine. But one of the things we've been bad at is speaking to other faiths. And we are not a majority faith in South Africa. We are visible, but we're not a majority. Those who are a majority, particularly Christians, have a very different view of Palestine from the one we hold. And we have failed to effectively reach out to them and provide knowledge about the true state of the issue that has caused us to be so active and concerned. So I do urge us, as we set about thinking about 2026, part of the mandate we must write down in our program of action is that of going beyond our boundaries. It's absolutely imperative. But then, what do I see as the context? Well, I think we've had decades of not upholding the basic tenets of the United Nations Charter. The globe has allowed the emergence of the economic colossus, which is the United States economy, an economy mirrored to a great degree by patterns of growth in China, in India, in Brazil, and in East Asia. These are emerging large economies in different regions of the world. But the pattern they're adopting is that pattern of eat first, benefit first, profit most. It is not one that advances positive values. And this is the world in which we live. The sameness of growth paths, of worker exploitation, and of the embrace of Western norms of accumulation and exploitation are what drives much of government concern at present and a great deal of the attention of trade unions. Our trade unions have become extremely bureaucratic and administrative and will not execute what they should, which you laid out so beautifully. They won't stop the offloading at the docks. They'll be more concerned about getting an increment because they are bureaucratic and they have offices near the bosses. So we've got to find a way of reaching the trade unions and reaching the progressive, embedded component of the trade unions, which is largely missing from political action today. What we have as our context today is the reality of the existence of countries that become the hook and others that become the hooked. This militates against the pursuit of shared values of equality, freedom, justice, and human dignity. If you are hooked, you follow the dictates of the hooker. If you do not have an ability to be free from being hooked, it's difficult for you to uphold these political ideals. The expectations of economic empowerment of many of our citizens means that governments, political organizations, and at times even non-governmental organizations become hostages of the search for prosperity, for a fair livelihood, and become then organizations and individuals with a diminished attachment to the ideals of freedom, democracy, and justice. Of course, as I say this, I'm fully alert that in the past 2 years there has been a shift. But I think we need to harness it effectively. The context needs an approach that puts positive values first, needs an organization that recognizes the just cause of Palestinians and the reality of Zionist fears and prejudice built over many years. To address this problem definitively, we are going to have to address both Israel and Palestine. We're not going to be able to ignore them. And anyone who comes before you and sounds very radical and polemic and insists that only Palestine needs attention, they are actually fooling you. We've got to address the complexity of the two, and the solution must address the complexity over the two. I believe that this context needs courage, courage of execution, courage to disregard, courage to disobey. That's what we need to build. We require global partnerships in which human rights are promoted and upheld, in which free expression, academic freedom, and respect for all aspects of human dignity are enshrined. I've been horrified that South African universities, which were the proponents of academic sanctions, are today arguing for partnerships with Israeli institutions. And when you go and speak in front of them, as I did, the vice chancellors start going, and then they say, Ms. Pando, the situation has altered from the 1970s. So I asked them, what is the difference in human rights from the 1970s to the 2000s? Surely every person deserves to enjoy human rights. And any action we can take to promote that enjoyment, we should be ready to take it. We have seen the worst diminution of academic freedom in the past 3 decades in this year, and we're not concerned. And as they go for higher education institutions, the next are going to be colleges, and the next will be schools. I am a former academic, and there's no way any premier from any country or province will ever tell me what to teach. But it's being done in some countries. And higher education is silent because we've lost that edge of progressive thought. We need commitment to organizing globally, organizing locally, organizing nationally, and organizing effectively. Since the so-called 20-point peace plan, which very few of us have seen, there's been silence in terms of protests, as though the people of Palestine are free. But they are not free. Self-determination has not been achieved. There is no ceasefire. They continue to be murdered. But why are the millions not on the street? People are arguing, where is this going to take us? Well, we have to remind them that they continued to march for almost 4 decades against apartheid South Africa. And we want them to do the same now for Palestine. And we must be that reminder. I think we should say to the Hague Group that greater effort to resolving the Palestinian cause is urgent. That they need to be clear that this issue of freedom and self-determination for Palestinians is the world's tinderbox. It is the greatest test of our ability to conduct a struggle since the anti-apartheid struggle against South Africa. This is the test that we face. Given the absence of a visible, legitimate, and recognized political organ of Palestine, the Hague Group needs to be bold in taking up such a leadership role. It must not hide behind right-sounding but amorphous notions of respecting international law. That's great. I think it's lovely. But they must say the freedom of the Palestinian people, the genocide we are seeing today, these are evils that we as Hague Group plan to combat in whatever space we have influence. That's what I think we want. I certainly want to see from the Hague Group. I'm a bit worried because I'm not sure as we sit here who we are. I mean, I know who I am, but and I know all of you, but I would have wanted to see a Hague Group meeting of the heads of state. And I would want to hear them say that they commit to this difficult tinderbox of freeing the Palestinian people. We need to state that the global tragedy is Palestine, and that the Hague Group must become the O.R. Tambo and Johnny McCartini of this century. And they must persuade all regional organizations, SADC, ECOWAS, all of them, and progressive governments, wherever they may find them, and also all those with progressive potential, to agree that the global political task of this time is the freedom of Palestinians and an outcome for the people of Israel. And that we must use all the means necessary, to paraphrase Malcolm X, to achieve this freedom. If the Hague Group does not commit to this, then its existence becomes something pleasant, but ineffectual. And I don't wish to be part of something like that. I recall being in a meeting, you know, being a Minister of Foreign Affairs, you meet everyone, all sorts of people, and you hear all sorts of things. But those will go into my book in future. But one of the interesting experiences you have is, for example, the recent expansion of BRICS. Many leaders thought this would be a good idea. Myself and the DJ, we were worried. And it was my reluctant task to achieve expansion, much as I believed it would impact on what BRICS could become. Why did I believe this? You have countries that are not democracies that have become interested in joining BRICS. You have countries that abuse human rights that have expressed an interest in becoming a member of BRICS. So you sit in those meetings and you come along with a beautiful resolution, and because you don't have clear rules around decision making, because you just come together due to shared ideals, you don't have a constitution, you don't have guiding rules, you decide by consensus. So what happens? You table this matter. One country says, no, we can never agree, the matter is dead. I hope the Hague Group doesn't become like that. I've seen from experience it leads nowhere and it defeats progressive purposes. So one of the things the Hague Group should do when they meet, write clear rules. What's the intention? Clear rules. What is your intention? How will you make decisions? What are the basic norms that unite you? Do they include an agenda such as this one? If they don't, I believe you will be irrelevant to the world. And I'll say so in public, and that will be bad for you because I'm very popular. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pandor. Even though the Hague Group was formed after Dr. Pandor's term, I believe that the spirit of the Hague Group really is embodied in the courage that you brought to your term in office, and that we hope will infect not just the 8 members and the 13 signatories of the group now, but really every single progressive political party and government that should come to power and work, as Nelson Mandela said, with the idea that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. I want to thank all of our speakers here today once again for their testimonies, for their critical analysis, for their wonderful, wonderful remarks. And open the floor for questions from the audience. I will try to collect them in bunches of 3. I see many hands up already, so I do request everyone to please try to make your questions rather than statements, and if you could be brief when you ask them. We have 2 volunteers. Leila Hazaini, who's on the floor, will be passing the mic around. So maybe we'll start at the front here with the lady in the red.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Odile. I'm a former UNICEF civil servant, so I feel very compelled to ask 2 questions. The first one is, how is the Hague Group reaching out to the African Union? It's been mentioned earlier that some African countries are succumbing to threats and bullying. I think it might be a good thing to have a meeting to explain and, like Dr. Pandor said, try to win those heads of states. The second one is related to Francesca Albanese. I don't think we cannot mention her here today. She was here recently, and her report has been submitted to the General Assembly, or the third committee, I should say, with denouncing the countries that are helping the genocide. Are you working with her structure, knowing that she is banned in the US? I mean, she's been attacked and everything. So these would be my 2 questions, because her report is quite explanatory on what we could be doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have another question behind her right here.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Vanessa Farr, and I, too, am an escaped UN civil servant. My question for you, please, is what about the eco side? I think this is probably the most unifying issue in the world today. We live in a closed earth system. We are all breathing the air that has been bombed above Gaza. the fact that we can say things like this is the equivalent of 6 atomic bombs, etc., this is a totally shared concern. We do not know what the pollutants are that are being released in the toxification of the airs, the waters. The Mediterranean is a shared sea. All of the waters and all of the air on this earth circulate. We are all breathing the air of Gaza. So how are we relating this to the climate crisis, not the least of which is these deadly and terrifying storms that have flooded and taken out Gaza, whose soils have been so decimated that they cannot hold water. Thank you.
Thank you. And here, are you also UN official, ma'am?
I am not a UN official. Yes, I'm unemployed. But I am a solidarity activist. I mean, I think Minister Naledi said unions do have problems, and they are not doing what they're supposed to do. But I think in the issue of South Africa being a member state of the Hague Commission, South Africa is still allowing coal to be exported. And you don't need trade unions to stop that. The minister who's blocking that is an ANC member who's hiding behind WTO rules. And it's not just the coal. Given our history, South Africa should really be leading on arms embargo, sanctions, cultural, sports, and academic boycotts, right? Because we know in the South African situation, BDS works, so we need more BDS. Actually, because also I've listened to most of the speakers, and we are being told every time that we need to respect the Hague Group, UN, and all these international bodies. But it's our activism that has brought what is happening and the progress that we've made for Palestine. Because despite what we're saying, for example, about the UN, Israel is still acting with impunity. And so is South Africa as a member of the Hague Group. We have South African citizens who are serving in the IOF, and they brag about it on social media, and they act with absolute impunity despite the laws of this country. And yet we see the contradiction, because the same is not happening with citizens who's been fooled or whatever to go and serve in Ukraine. So what is the Hague Group doing about a member state who is not complying with their resolutions?
Thank you for that. I'll let the panelists answer the first 3 questions, and I see you, sir, in the front row here, and if anyone else with other questions, come back to you after. There again, we'll come back to you after a first round. After a first round of answers. Thank you. I'm going to invite Zain, Saleh, Guillaume to perhaps answer. Dr. Pandor, if you want to use your retirement to punt some of the harder questions to Zain, we'll allow that on the stage.
So I'll try and answer a few of these questions. So I think, Udin, the engagement with the African Union is important. What we've done is engaged individual African countries. I'm not going to name them to try and get on board. And that's been done at various levels, at the diplomatic level, official level. And we've had, for example, we've had Senegal and others coming on board. But, the power dynamics are immense. We have to point that out. You cannot ignore power dynamics when it comes to actions. And I think this is the context that, Dr. Pandor is talking about. Making statements is one thing, engaging in the actions in the political context where there's a huge political force that people will come to you in private and say, we support X, Y, and Z, but we will never say it in public because of the repercussions that are real both to states, the economies, and to individuals. And we have to be cognizant of that. Which brings us to working with Francesca Albanese. Right? So we are working with her on various fronts, not just the latest reports, but all the other reports. And working with the recommendations that comes from her and other special rapporteurs on the issue of genocide within what we can do as a state. And we must talk about the limits of state action. State action is limited. And if you don't combine state action with mass mobilization, then that political context becomes a lot more difficult. We were able to go to the ICJ through cabinet when you had all of cabinet supportive. Will you have the same decision now? Right? I'm just saying that. So decisions are made not in a vacuum. They are underpinned by power and a critical mass that supports and underpins that decisions. And that's something that we must, talk about. I'm not going to answer the issue of ecocide. I think maybe some of the others can, but if not, then I'll come back to that. On maybe the last one on the breaches by South Africa, I think, so we have an arms embargo in place. We are not allowed to sell arms to South Africa, to any state involved in conflict, and that includes especially Israel. So we do see some of the demonstrations, but when we look at what we've approved, it explicitly excludes sales of arms, ammunition to Israel. Okay, so on ports, we blocked a ship we were alerted by the Palestinian activists that there was a ship en route which may or may not carry arms, and we used the agreements that we've made for that ship to be searched, and there was no arms. Okay, so we do think that the issue of ports is being respected, but again, if one compares what our trade unions are doing with the Italians, it's a vastly different experience. Again, the limits of state action has to be brought into perspective. You have a state in Italy that is not as supportive as ours, but the trade unions put enough pressure on certain actions to change, and that the limits of state action must be brought into perspective again. And then again, I think, on the South African citizens returning, if they do return, they will be arrested. At the moment, we are not seeing much of that. There's a court case happening that is going to look at whether in the past, in previous times, people have come through. But we have, again, the same rules applying, that if you go and enlist and in an army without permission of the existing legislation, you are breaching a law. And we've made that very clear that when we do, and we work, sometimes the Hein Rajab Foundation gives us a heads up that somebody may be coming in or may not be coming in, and then we track that. We cannot go back. Maybe people have come back 5 years ago. We have to track that. But I do think that we must put that into perspective as well. So the court case is something that will give us a declarator on many other issues. But on that, we as DIRCO would be, if we find out somebody's coming in, we'd alert the Hawks, and people would be, and as yet, we will, we're looking at the papers. We will find, if we find them, they will have to be prosecuted. The Ukraine issue is slightly different. It's not people that enlisted actively. It's an issue of trafficking. They were trafficked under misinformation about where they were going. And the charges is dealing very specifically with human trafficking. So it's not the same act at play.
I think we have the law in South Africa, and if anyone here is aware of an individual whose name you know and who you definitively know is participating, because social media, they do all kinds of little videos and all that, and it's all some young men sometimes who are lying, but it may be a young man who you went to school with at Herzliya or somewhere else. Make the name public. Go and put a charge at a police station. Because I have a concern, people come, Naledi, what are you doing? Why is it Naledi only? Why don't we also do something? So let's identify them, name them, put their pictures and their names in the newspaper. We can collectively put money for a joint advert with all their names made public in South African media. So we can expose these people, and we should commit to do so. But it needs action from us, joint action in that regard. And on the matter of trade unions, it was trade unions on their own that said we won't sell South African fruit. trade unions on their own. It was shopkeepers. I remember I was a little girl in England, and we'd go to the grocer and he'd say, I don't sell South African fruit. An ordinary Cockney. So it's doable. And to always look to the government, I don't know. I think, yes, we petition them, must protest, expose them, but our action as activists is the one that makes a difference. And if the trade unions, NUMSA, I've been talking to them about the coal because it is NUMSA employees who work in that company. And I keep saying to Irvin, come on, pick up the pace. Pick up the pace. The government doesn't sell coal. So let us be active in institutions, in front of defense companies that are selling arms. We've got a clear rule in South Africa, but if you know that some companies breaching it, let us know. We're quite good at executing the arms control legislation. So give us the information, make it public, and government will act. I'm no longer part of government, but I'll push them to act.
Maybe I'll just very briefly address the question about ecocide. I think it's very clear that climate justice is impossible without Palestinian liberation. The Israeli regime has deliberately targeted the Palestinian environment in Gaza in the last 2 years. We've seen complete devastation. We're talking about at least 40 million tons of rubble in this tiny piece of land, and much of that rubble is hazardous, contains unexploded materials, contains still the bodies of at least 10 to 15,000 of our martyrs. The soil has been completely contaminated and poisoned, so that anything that grows there will also be contaminated and poisoned. The seawater is filled with sewage. And I think, all of this illuminates the critical intersections that exist between the climate struggle and the Palestinian struggle. Zionism has always been destructive to the environment. It's a colonial ideology. It's a destructive force, and nothing is safe, no person, no olive tree. Israel is positioning itself as this great leader of the struggle against climate change in the Eastern Mediterranean. It makes these arguments that it made the desert bloom, and in fact, long before the genocide, the Israeli regime has been involved in deeply destructive policies, including planting these non-native trees to the Palestinian landscape, trees which are very flammable and completely has completely destroyed the ecosystem. The over-irrigation of the Palestinian desert in the Naqab has completely messed up the water system and the water table there. So this is not something new. The Israeli regime, the Zionist ideology, is a destructive one. And I think it's really important that we don't allow it to continue with this greenwashing mission that it's engaging in now, especially, as I mentioned, in the Eastern Mediterranean.
I'll make kind of three quick comments, kind of in an answer. But first, on the African Union, I think it's important to note about the African Commission for Humans and People's Rights resolution that came out in November of 2024, the first one in 24 years on Palestine. And thanks to a push by Palestinian and African groups and civil society, we have now a resolution that reminds that the African Charter sees Zionism as a racist ideology that is on par with apartheid, colonialism, neocolonialism, and calls for its eradication. That it makes it a responsibility of African states to eradicate Zionism as they have a responsibility to eradicate apartheid. I think we should really use that resolution to push for African states to uphold their obligations under the African Charter as well as under international law. The resolution very clearly says that Israel is an apartheid regime and that African states must ensure that they're not complicit in this apartheid regime, and this is just an important tool. And kind of linked to this, we got this resolution because of people power pushing, civil society pushing the Commission to do this. And this is where we were able to achieve. We have the Hague Group. We have states, including in Europe, starting to take action because there was people power and mobilization and pushing. And this is just a response to Sister Obaida, or kind of a comment, building up actually on what you're saying, that Israel has lost, for example, just as an example, Israel has lost over or around 70% of what it enjoyed from the EU Horizon program. That is a program that supports research, academia, and so on. Not because of a decision from the EU, because of a decision from academics, academic institutions, universities, departments within universities that have decided that they will not collaborate, that they will boycott the Israeli academia. And it's just an example of how actually through people power, only through people power that we're able to create the change that we want. But of course, there is a responsibility on states. The Hague Group is ultimately about obligations clarified by the International Court of Justice, adopted by the UN General Assembly, that states have not to recognize an illegal situation and not to render aid and assistance to genocide, apartheid, and this illegal occupation. But I want to say something here about the Hague Group that is also kind of from another perspective, that it is about the sovereignty of states. What can we say about sovereignty when a state cannot uphold obligations under international law because of coercion from outside, bullying from the US and European powers, or pressure groups that exist inside, or the power of cooperations? And this is the case not only in South Africa, but also elsewhere. So the importance of the Hague Group is, yes, for accountability, for the end of Israel's impunity, but there is something about the sovereignty of states in the Global South in particular, that when I have an obligation under international law, I want to act in sovereignty to uphold this obligation. But what I have against this are these forces coming from outside and inside. And I think just we have to also keep that in mind about the importance of the Hague Group. Thank you.
Yes, I certainly don't want to draw a rosy picture, and that's what I hope I didn't do that in my intervention. I think the situation has been, at the global level, very bleak. And I said it was people who had lived up to their historic responsibility, whereas states had been, largely speaking, absent. So I echo what everybody said here. It's people power that has to push states in the right direction. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, we're going back to the African Union. I mean, there are only 3 states in Africa that are members of the Hague Group. South Africa, the key founding member, Namibia, and Senegal. Where are all the others? So I'm really not trying to sell this rosy picture that everything's great in the Global South. On the contrary. I'm not even talking of the Arab League here, right? So it's tough, but we have to make a choice. Do we want to wield all the leverages of power? I think we should. I think we need to push all the leverages of power, including state power, to put an end to the genocide, to apartheid, to occupation, to settler colonialism in Palestine. And I think that is what the Hague Group is attempting to do. And I think in the context of other Global South institutions that are not living up to what they should be doing, including historic organizations like the G77, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the United Nations. I'm a former ambassador at the UN, and I speak to my former colleagues, and they spend months and years elaborating sophisticated pieces of international law, and then what? The next day is violated. Yeah, absolutely. So that was the spirit behind the Hague Group, right? No more rhetoric. We will, the members of the Hague Group, comply with our obligations, with the very things that we voted for. Now, of course, retaliation exists, intimidation exists, Sanctions exist. It's a dangerous world out there. And a lot of countries are bullied. I mean, I won't give any names, but we know we actually didn't launch with 8 states. Barsha said 8. We launched with 9. Within a week, we'd lost one. I suspect a phone call, right? So not a rosy picture. It's a struggle, it's a fight, it's imperfect, for sure, very imperfect. But I do think states have a role to play in putting an end to the genocide in Palestine, and I think people should push states. Social movements should push states. Unions, organized people should push states to do more and live up to their historic responsibility in this day and age.
Thank you, Guillaume. I'd now like to take the next set of 3 questions. They might have to be our last 3. Leila, I see hands. One hand here, and then one here, right here.
Thank you, Chair. Over the years, I've developed calluses on my hands, clapping Sali, Jazi, Naledi, Pando, and Zain in particular, and for the others in absence as well. But I think the important thing about the Hague Group is its accountability to the civil movement protesting against the impunity of Israel. And there needs to be a greater deal of transparency. And as former Minister Pandor pointed out, we need to do that very rapidly to retain a credibility around this. One of the positive developments in South Africa in terms of protest movements, picking up from what Saleh is saying, and what Dirko has issued a statement on the 29th of November, 30th of November, around the Apartheid Convention, and civil society have rallied, and they've convinced 8 political parties in South Africa to put forward a apartheid bill to domesticate the UN Convention in South Africa, and that process is unfolding, and that's a great battle that is unfolding. The chances of, the question is the chances of other countries adopting that within the Hague Group speedily and rapidly and swiftly, which will embolden us as well. Minister Pandor, former Minister Pandor, the wish is further to the thought, has indicated that, give me the names. Well, Ground-Up has given a name of a person who has contravened the Foreign Military Assistance, the regulations on the Foreign Military Assistance Act, Mr. Benjamin Rattle, who is in Hermanus at the moment, who was reported, who the Department of Defense has indicated he doesn't have permission to be there, who has admitted to Ground-Up that he is in the northern parts of Israel. In addition to the current one. The Hawks know about it, they may even have visited him, but there is no prosecution. And that is the big dilemma that civil society faces. And was it former President Nelson Mandela or somebody else who said, if they don't do their job, you must do something to them. And that is almost the feeling that is restlessly inhabiting the minds of the civil society movement. So on those 2 cases, and I think, why is it that the NPA is not prosecuting them? And I do think that, and he's still here. He's in Stanford, he's in Hermanus. So do we do a citizen's arrest? Do we go there? And how do we go about those kinds of things led by the Hague Group around us? The third thing is, I think we need to have a combination. If we're going to make 2026 the year of the Hague, then we need to embrace all these things, but it needs to be done maybe in a more collaborative, coordinated kind of way, better than what it is, and well done for the work so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you see us at the back?
We have hands at the back, to the right there.
Chair, thanks. My name is Neil Coleman. I'm a former political detainee and a long-time trade unionist. It can't be that we have to make a choice between trade union activism and intervention by the state. The trade unions need to stop the export of coal and other strategic exports to Israel, but the state also needs to act. The Colombian state banned the export of coal from Colombia. As Zain knows, this is an issue I've been raising, and I've been raising the issue with the trade unions as well. But the issue that I wanted to raise was that as ex-political detainees and prisoners in South Africa, we are very concerned about the 9,000 to 10,000, possibly more, detainees, political detainees, in Israeli prisons and jails, and the horrific conditions that they're facing. Can Yara perhaps speak about what these detainees are facing on a daily basis and what he thinks and other panelists think should be done to draw attention to their plight and to act to ensure they're released? Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Leila, we have a hand here on the right, the lady at the back.
Hi, Khadija from Radio 786. Is South Africa being used as an example of what happens to a country that stands with Palestine? And how can groups like The Hague provide support for states taking similar stances?
I'll maybe take one final question, and we'll have to unfortunately close after that. We have a hand here on the left.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a short question. We've gone to court, the ICJ 2 years ago. I think in the middle of this year, we agreed to an extension and gave the Israelis an extension to answering papers. That extension is supposed to expire now in December. When can we expect them in court at The Hague?
Thank you. Maybe you abuse my chair's privilege to begin this round of answers with me. We've talked a lot about international law here and what states' obligations are, what it applies, where it applies, and what Israel should do, so on and so forth. We forget that the Hague Group measures, first, are a small subset of a very long list of obligations that exist across all states. And 124 nations signed on to these obligations. They're diplomats in the UN after, as Guillaume said, after weeks and months of deliberation, crafting every single word very carefully, signed on to say, yes, we as the government of Brazil, we as the government of Senegal, we as the government of France, of the United Kingdom, sign on to these obligations. What the Hague Group did is not try to make new international law, but ask why is it that international law doesn't have teeth anymore? Why is it that we are unable to see enforcement of this existing international law that we fought so hard for? And it's a bit gimmicky, and I really mean the word gimmicky in that sense, because what we did at the beginning of this year is take the same commitments out of the halls of the United Nations and out into the public fora. Ask the same 124 governments, will you now adopt not even all of the 34 obligations listed there, but what we thought was a minimum bar, accountability, exports, and ports. Will you adopt these 3 measures in this moment? And the Hague Group was born at the moment of 400 days of the genocide. And the 400th day of genocide, will you adopt these 3 measures? And it's shameful to see that we saw just 8 nations say yes. That's accountability. I am an activist, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not part of any of the governments, but this is precisely the kind of transparency that allows each of us, as trade unions, as social movements, and as activists, to hold governments accountable, because international law has gone to die in the halls of the UN and in the halls of the multilateralism in the last few years. And that's precisely the impotency that we wanted to combat by bringing it out into the open fora, by bringing these individuals here on this stage to be questioned by each of you. So one of the things that's extremely important to point out is the Hague Group wasn't just about holding Israel accountable, but holding itself accountable. It's automatically a self-audit mechanism because everything that every member state, a signatory of the Hague Group, has committed to is out in the public fora, repeatedly presented, so that each of the trade unions can hold each of these states accountable and allow the individuals, the specific ministries working within each government to have more teeth in their combat, sometimes against their own minister, sometimes in their own cabinets, and sometimes against again, Zionist lobbies in their own countries, even when they are in power. On the question of how much space there exists to act, look at the members of the Hague Group. If you go to a country like Honduras, a founding member, it's a small Caribbean nation that right now is fighting for its own land. It just lost the election a week ago by the brazen interference of Donald Trump, who endorsed a candidate and threatened to issue tariffs and intervene if that candidate did not win. And well before this, when the Hague Group was formed, Honduras was facing a $10.3 billion lawsuit from a company that was headed by the founder of Palantir, another evil, of course, in Palestine, but really across all of our lands in the global south, who wanted to build a charter city and a libertarian paradise for billionaires, essentially, crypto billionaires from California. And when the socialist government of Honduras protested, were hit with a $10.5 billion lawsuit, which, I mean, to put it in context here, is 2/3 of the small Caribbean islands' entire annual national budget. That's the space in which we're acting, not only as retaliation for Palestine, but really for attempting to liberate our own lands and our own economy. The reason we see each of these things as interlinked is I come from India, a country that has made a complete U-turn in its solidarity with Palestine, a government that has made a complete U-turn in its solidarity with Palestine. When we try to kick Adani out of our country, it's of course for Palestine, but it's also so that we ourselves can liberate ourselves from the Modi government, whose Hindu supremacist ideology is essentially a twin-sister ideology of the Zionist ideology that we see subjugating the Palestinian people.
I want to say that indeed I agree that the state should act and civil society should act. I think these are necessary components to a successful struggle. But I do think we need to be realistic about the challenges, particularly that are faced by governments. I tried to outline the context. When you are a government in a weak position in a coalition and you're confronted with the loss of 100,000 jobs, I think you struggle to hold up the principles of the Hague Group. And when civil society retreats and doesn't say, we support you in the Hague Group or in the ICJ case, because you don't hear that voice sufficiently, then it disempowers the state. So we've also got to look at how we integrate these different focal points into the various activities that we undertake. I also think part of the challenge is that there's a massive propaganda machinery that we are working against with extremely weak tools on our part. This propaganda machinery is able to make some of us devils. And we say nothing. There's no response. So how do we up our communication? How do we up those tools that the Zionists are adept at utilizing so that we put them to good effect in defense of the task we have chosen to undertake? Is our communication up to the mark? A podcaster from the UK who recently experienced a spell in American cells was saying, while there is amazing visible activism on the streets in South Africa, in terms of popular use of social media, you don't see the same level of activism. So we need to look at all the tools that make up the components of a struggle today, because it has very different forms from what we had in the past. We, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, have been trying to persuade the General Assembly to recreate an anti-apartheid UN committee against apartheid Israel, as they had with respect to apartheid South Africa. We've gone there, we've put an exhibition up on the UN committee that existed in the past and shown the work that it is able to do. But we don't get a bite from the diplomats there. In fact, there's almost a sense of fear of being seen to act. So we should contend with all these elements that make up the challenge of today and not pretend that it's all easy, you know, that our strongest statement or the biggest march, the great doi doi, is the sum. It's not. We're dealing with something that has been stewed for years, that has developed arms and legs. We had funds withdrawn from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and then we were able to find funds from those who support progressive causes. So what is happening, I have a case today on a PAIA application on where did we get funds for Francesca Albanese's lecture. What business is that of anyone? So this is the kind of response, and it's permitted in our constitution. So by law, I'm supposed to respond. But if a Zionist comes here and gives a lecture, no one stands up, no one protests. There's a professor at UCT taking the university council to court because of their correct decision to institute an academic boycott. How many of us stand up in front of UCT and say, correct decision at last? So we must act in all the domains that make up a struggle.
So just on the question of Palestinian political prisoners, since the genocide began over 2 years ago, the number of Palestinians incarcerated in Israeli prisons is estimated to be about 10,900. That is a guess because many people have been taken and their whereabouts remain unknown. Palestinian prisoners taken from Gaza are separated usually and kept in different prisons to those from Palestinians from other parts of Palestine. And we know from accounts of those who are coming out, because of course the Israelis don't allow in anyone to any kind of human rights organizations, any kind of lawyers, witnesses, anything to account for the conditions inside the prisons. So we know from testimonies from those who have come out, and they have come out completely decimated, completely destroyed, because they're being denied access to food, they're being denied access to medical treatment, they're being systematically tortured, and we also know that they're being systematically sexually abused. We know that many of those who were taken from Gaza and have been disappeared include doctors, health workers. And we know that this is not a new phenomenon. The incarceration, the mass incarceration of Palestinians has been a tactic that the Israeli regime has used for decades. There's not a single Palestinian who doesn't have some kind of experience with Israeli incarceration, whether that's, you know, their relatives or their loved ones having spent time in prison. And it's a deliberate tactic to destroy and devastate Palestinian society. And it's a successful one, I must say. And it's something that hasn't been given a lot of attention. In fact, the Israeli regime has incarcerated more prisoners than it has released in the various hostage deals, and quite often those that are released in those deals are rearrested weeks or months later. And Saleh also reminded me to mention that there have been many that have actually been killed in recent months in Israeli incarceration. So the situation is incredibly dire. But it also has a very successful chilling effect on political activism and mobilization in Palestine on the ground. There is no space for any kind of political activity. They have taken so many of our brightest and best, and it has had a serious impact on the wider Palestinian society.
maybe just a little bit to add on this, I was bringing up the last letter that the BDS movement has received from Palestinian prisoners, which was on the 10th of March 2019. And in terms of what to do, what the prisoners themselves have been asking is to escalate BDS. There's more that can be done, but this comes as well from them. BDS action by you and others around the world, has before forced the company G4S to leave. It is the complicity of states and corporations and institutions that also allows for this mass incarceration, this sanctioned and systematic regime of torture. More Palestinian prisoners have been killed as a result of torture in Israeli prisons over the last couple of years than they were killed since 1967. So you could still take action locally, escalate BDS locally with this impact that we hope to have for the release of all Palestinian political prisoners. I just wanted to quickly on the question about when the procedure of the ICJ and so on, and I appreciate, sir, that your interest may be just to understand like what is the process here, but I want to use this opportunity to say that we should not wait for the ICJ to make its ruling. The ICJ has already highlighted the risk of genocide, and this immediately triggers obligations by states to ensure that they are not contributing or are not complicit to this genocide, as well as corporations. But also that we have 2 reports from Francesca Albanese, a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights on the occupied Palestinian territories. We have a report by the Commission of Inquiry that was appointed by the Human Rights Council. This is a UN report. We have a report by Amnesty International saying that it is genocide. So it is very clear that it is genocide, that this genocide continues, and the obligations on states, on corporations, on institutions, on what to do and they should do is also very clear. So while, yes, of course, we need to understand the process and what's happening, but we should not let these postponements of the court, of giving Israel more time, of waiting, because it could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we don't know, right? The judges are actually changing, I believe, next year, right? So there is still a bureaucratic process. And what we should do is, yes, keep an eye, but really take action. Because a genocide is happening, the UN has said it, civil society has said it, and the obligations towards what we should do is very clear.
There was a question on Francesca Albanese, just very, very quickly. Francesca's been very supportive of the Hague Group from the start. And she was there in Bogota when we managed to have 31 countries endorsing these measures. And it was interesting, actually, that a lot of these countries were there also in support of Francesca Albanese, which is quite interesting in the context of the sanctions that had just been, that she'd just been a victim of a few days before the meeting in Bogota. So that was, I think, important. And she has led on a very important letter to states, along with 23 other special rapporteurs and UN experts, for all states to join the Hague Group. So she's been really, really supportive, and we really appreciate her support, and we pay tribute and homage to her as well, of course, in the context of these draconian sanctions.
I just wanted to add that the ICJ case was an important step, because one of the characteristics that Israel relies on is impunity and being seen as almost entirely innocent. And what the ICJ case did was place them before the court of international opinion. And I think it exposed Israel hugely. So it's very important that we continue to talk about it. But we do need to pay more attention to the political prisoners. And there is this Mandela set of rules of the UN that we should demand need to be implemented. You will recall, with respect to Nelson Mandela, there was an agreement that the International Red Cross visited him on a regular basis, and you had Helen Suzman, who was an opposition member of parliament, who insisted that she would visit. But there was a clear figure that was focused upon, Nelson Mandela and his companions. We need a focus on Marwan Barghouti and a campaign that clearly articulates the call for his release. And also we should be highlighting that the rights of all political prisoners should be respected. Israelis call themselves the only democracy in the Middle East, which is embarrassing in my view for them. But we need to call out the so-called democracy and say there's no democracy that exercises apartheid administrative detention without charge or trial, as does this so-called democracy. So we also need to highlight the callous conduct of the Israeli state, as well as the elements that were so outlined with respect to the environmental degradation and the threat to human life of pollution and other effects of this ongoing onslaught.
Thanks. I think I'm just going to answer two small issues. I think the extension of the ICJ is given by the court itself. So we've objected to the extension. And what we found is these objections are supposed to be confidential, but in a recent parliamentary hearing, members of the public and opposition parties were raising issues to us that emerged from issues that were supposed to be confidential. So it means that one party has not been respecting the confidentiality in breach of the rules of the court itself, and we've raised that with the court as well. So we objected to the extension. We felt there was no reason for the extension, and we basically had to settle that the final submission date is now, I think it's March the 16th, yeah? That's, am I correct? Yeah, it's March the 16th, but I don't think we're going to count on this any more extensions on that. But that's for the merits of the case. And there is, together with the UN reports, we've also submitted what is publicly available evidence to the UN Security Council as South Africa. And these are, they're available on our website as well. And you can find significant evidence that basically underlies our claim of genocide in the publicly available evidence. I just want to conclude on, basically, I think somebody mentioned Gramsci and the wolf position issue perhaps, and I think Dr. Pandor has been speaking about, are we winning the wolf position? And I know I've had informal discussions with colleagues in this room that says if the march is not going to be massive, it's a challenge for us, because there is an assertion that government is acting without the support of the public. Right? So there's a wolf position issue. And colleagues here will know that South Africa has played a major role in mobilizing for the establishment of the Hague Group. And that created tensions for South Africa in Washington, D.C. The Hague Group was earmarked as a malicious act, and South Africa was outlined as the instigator of this malicious grouping, right? We take stances in the international community, despite our limitations. We take stances that does push the envelope, whether it's on international law or international diplomacy. And we do that confident that the vast majority of South Africans support us, but that does not come through, as Minister Pandor has said, through the articulation in the public media. And that comes at a cost. I mean, Minister Pandor's visa to the US was recently withdrawn, right? There's a bill in Washington on Capitol Hill that, if it's passed, will give rise to what is called sanctions under the Magnitsky Act on and I want to quote the words for you, individuals, including past officials and present officials who've weaponized international law against Israel. It's publicly available, but there's no international or domestic action against that. So I want to raise this issue of the wolf position. We are taking risks, and it comes at a cost. And I'm just being very blunt here. There's allegations over the last 3 years of Turco's been captured firstly by jihadis, all right? And then now the latest is captured by BDS. But there's no pushback from those, actually not enough pushback in a popular and public way around what we are doing that is pushing the envelope in the right direction. And that level of support will allow us to win the wolf position.
Thank you, Zain, and thank you to all of our panelists for both your excellent remarks, for your answers to the question. To our wonderful audience, I'm very sorry that we could not take all the questions. I saw many hands shoot up in the air, but as always, we are limited for time. But I want to thank each of you for making time today. I have been reminded by all of my South African comrades that today is the last working day of December, and very specifically that begins at noon today. I so appreciate that you began your break with by coming to this meeting to meet both the Hague Group, our comrades from Palestine, and really it's an honor for us to be in South Africa. And I wanted to say to both Dr. Pandor and to Zain here, for each of us, especially in countries still struggling with incredibly challenging conditions, South Africa has been a real inspiration for the courage and boldness with which you've not just acted for Palestine, but really, I believe, for the spirit of decolonization and for global South countries around the world. So thank you to both of you and to all of our panelists and our wonderful audience here today.